In the spring of 1945, as World War II raged toward its climax, the United States faced an abrupt leadership crisis that would reshape the post-war world. On April 12, at 3:35 p.m. Eastern Time, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage while sitting for a portrait in his retreat at Warm Springs, Georgia. He was 63 years old, and despite his visible frailty during the recent Yalta conference, his death caught the nation and his own vice president off guard. Roosevelt had been battling severe health issues for years, including polio since 1921 and, more critically, congestive heart failure diagnosed in 1944. His physicians had warned him that his blood pressure was dangerously high, often exceeding 250/150, and that he might not survive another term. Yet, in true FDR fashion, he kept these details tightly under wraps, sharing them only with a select few confidants. This secrecy extended to his succession planning. He never prepared his vice president, Harry S. Truman, for the immense responsibilities ahead. Truman, a modest Midwesterner from Independence, Missouri, was an unlikely figure to step into the shoes of one of America's most transformative presidents. Born in 1884 to a farming family, Truman's early life was marked by hard work and humility. He served as an artillery captain in World War I, where he led troops under fire in France, earning a reputation for steady leadership. After the war, he ran a haberdashery that failed during the 1921 recession, teaching him resilience amid economic hardship. Entering politics through Kansas City's Pendergast machine, Truman rose to become a U.S. Senator in 1934, where he gained national attention chairing a committee that exposed wartime contracting fraud, saving billions in taxpayer dollars. His no-nonsense style and integrity made him a safe, non-controversial choice for vice president at the 1944 Democratic National Convention, where party bosses sidelined the more progressive Henry Wallace amid fears of FDR's declining health. On that fateful afternoon, Truman was in the Capitol, sharing a bourbon with House Speaker Sam Rayburn, when an urgent call came from White House Press Secretary Steve Early at 5:25 p.m. "Come to the White House as quickly and quietly as possible," Early instructed, his voice tense. Truman pressed for details but got none over the phone. Rushing to the executive mansion by 5:47 p.m., he was escorted to the second-floor study where First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt awaited. Placing a hand on his arm, she delivered the news. "Harry, the president is dead." In a moment of characteristic grace under pressure, Truman asked if there was anything he could do for her. Eleanor's response underscored the gravity. "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." Sworn in as the 33rd president at 7:09 p.m., in the cabinet room, Truman inherited a nation at war on two fronts, with Allied forces closing in on Berlin and fierce battles ongoing in the Pacific. But his vice presidency had lasted just 82 days, during which FDR met with him only twice brief, ceremonial encounters that revealed nothing substantive. Truman was oblivious to key military strategies. The intricate diplomatic pacts forged with Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, or the top-secret Manhattan Project racing to develop the atomic bomb. This lack of preparation wasn't accidental. FDR's leadership style was highly centralized, compartmentalizing information to maintain control and prevent leaks. As a result, Truman entered the Oval Office knowing less about ongoing operations than many Washington insiders or even foreign leaders. This sudden transition highlighted the vulnerabilities in America's executive branch during a global conflict. Roosevelt, who had guided the country through the Great Depression with his New Deal and mobilized it for war, left behind a government apparatus tuned to his personal vision. Truman, with his plain-spoken demeanor and lack of Ivy League polish, faced immediate skepticism from FDR's inner circle. Yet, his background as a self-made man from the heartland equipped him with a pragmatic worldview, one that would soon clash with the idealistic remnants of Roosevelt's administration. As the new president settled into his role, the revelations that followed would test his resolve and force a reckoning with the realities of power in a rapidly changing world. As Truman assumed the presidency, the enormity of his isolation became painfully clear in his very first interactions with the government he now led. On the morning of the 13th of April 1945, just hours after being sworn in, he convened his inaugural cabinet meeting in the Oval Office. The room was filled with Roosevelt's seasoned advisors, men who had shaped policy through the depths of the Depression and the heights of wartime strategy. Figures like Secretary of State Edward Stettinius, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau Jr. had been at FDR's side for over a decade, privy to the intimate details of global alliances and domestic reforms. Truman, by contrast, entered as an outsider, his brief vice presidential tenure offering no real insight into the administration's inner workings. The atmosphere was thick with unease. Truman later recalled sensing an undercurrent of doubt from these officials, who viewed him not as a commanding presence but as a political expedient. A former senator from Missouri elevated to the ticket to balance regional interests and appease party moderates. Statinius, a polished diplomat handpicked by FDR, began briefing Truman on foreign affairs, but delivered information in vague, guarded terms, skirting specifics about ongoing negotiations. Stimson and others followed suit, offering overviews that felt more like formalities than full disclosures. This reticence wasn't mere oversight. It stemmed from a deep-seated loyalty to Roosevelt's methods and a subtle skepticism toward the new president's capabilities. Truman, with his straightforward Midwestern pragmatism, picked up on the dynamics immediately, noting in his diary that the group seemed to treat him as a temporary steward rather than the commander-in-chief. Compounding this tension was the staggering extent of what Truman didn't know, a direct consequence of FDR's secretive leadership style. During his 82 days as vice president, Truman had met privately with Roosevelt only twice, both sessions lasting less than 15 minutes and focusing on superficial matters like congressional relations. No discussions touched on the war's strategic endgame, the delicate balance of power in Europe, or the Pacific Theater's brutal island-hopping campaign. Roosevelt, ever the master of compartmentalization, had deliberately kept his vice president at arm's length, a decision influenced by his own health concerns and a preference for handling sensitive issues personally or through trusted aides. The most dramatic revelation came on the 24th of April 1945, 12 days into Truman's presidency, when Secretary Stimson requested a private audience to discuss an urgent matter. Truman anticipated updates on the European front, where Nazi Germany was crumbling, or the planned invasion of Japan, code-named Operation Downfall, which military planners estimated could cost up to 1 million American lives. Instead, Stimson unveiled the Manhattan Project, a colossal undertaking that had been shrouded in absolute secrecy since 1942. Under the direction of General Leslie Groves and physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, the project employed over 130,000 people across secret facilities like Los Alamos in New Mexico, Oak Ridge in Tennessee, and Hanford in Washington state. These weren't just labs. They were entire hidden cities, complete with housing, schools, and security perimeters, all dedicated to harnessing atomic energy for a weapon of unprecedented destruction. The scale was mind-boggling, a $2 billion investment equivalent to about $35 billion today, funneled through black budgets that bypassed standard congressional oversight. FDR had authorized it in 1939 after Albert Einstein's warning letter about Nazi nuclear ambitions, but he shared details with only a handful of insiders, including Stimson, Groves, and a few scientists. Even key allies like Churchill knew more than Truman did at that point. Truman's initial reaction was one of stunned disbelief, as he later confided, "I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." Yet, his World War I combat experience, where he had commanded artillery batteries under fire, helped him absorb the shock and pivot to practical questions. When would the bomb be ready? What were the ethical implications? Stimson's briefing emphasized the project's compartmentalization to thwart Axis spies, but it also exposed a flaw in FDR's system, leaving his successor dangerously uninformed at a pivotal moment. This atomic secret was just the tip of the iceberg. Truman soon delved into the outcomes of the Yalta Conference, held in February 1945 inches the Crimea, where FDR, Stalin, and Churchill had redrawn the map of post-war Europe. The agreements included partitioning Germany into occupation zones, commitments to free elections in liberated nations like Poland, and the establishment of the United Nations as a forum for international cooperation, FDR's crowning diplomatic vision. But the accords also contained ambiguities that Stalin exploited, such as vague language on democratic governments in Eastern Europe that allowed Soviet influence to dominate. Truman's requests for full briefings on these pacts met with evasive responses, revealing how FDR's administration had operated like a series of silos, with information flowing upward to the president but rarely sideways. Inheriting this opaque machinery, Truman faced not just a knowledge gap but a trust deficit. The cabinet's reluctance to fully brief him bred suspicion, hinting at deeper agendas tied to preserving FDR's legacy. As Allied victory loomed, Truman recognized that bridging these divides would require confronting the very architects of Roosevelt's policies. His military background instilled a sense of urgency. Wars weren't won by committees loyal to ghosts, but by unified teams facing facts head-on. This early period set the stage for Truman's evolving understanding of the Soviet threat, transforming his initial bewilderment into a resolve to realign the government around clear-eyed realism. As Truman grappled with the flood of revelations in his early days, the real battleground emerged within his own administration, the entrenched cabinet members who embodied Franklin Roosevelt's enduring influence. These officials weren't just holdovers. They were the architects of the New Deal and wartime victories, deeply invested in perpetuating FDR's worldview. Truman, with his outsider perspective, quickly perceived their reluctance not as mere caution but as a form of passive resistance, rooted in a profound allegiance to their late leader's policies and a quiet disdain for the new president's credentials. This dynamic turned routine briefings into subtle power struggles, where information became a currency of control. Take Edward Stettinius, the Secretary of State, a former Steel executive with a patrician air whom FDR had installed in late 1944 to manage the delicate web of Allied diplomacy. Stettinius had accompanied Roosevelt to the Yalta Conference, meticulously documenting the high-stakes negotiations that divided Europe and set the stage for the United Nations. When Truman pressed him for details on what FDR had committed to Stalin, specifics on Poland's borders, German reparations, or Soviet entry into the Pacific War, Stettinius responded with polished ambiguity. He alluded to spheres of influence and democratic transitions, but omitted the concessions that allowed Stalin to interpret agreements in ways that favored Soviet dominance. This wasn't forgetfulness. Stettinius, like others, saw himself as a guardian of FDR's grand design for post-war harmony, where cooperation with the Soviets was paramount. Revealing the full extent of those compromises might force Truman to unravel them, tarnishing Roosevelt's legacy. Henry Morgenthau Jr., the long-serving Secretary of the Treasury, presented another layer of friction. A close personal friend of FDR since their neighboring estates in New York's Hudson Valley, Morgenthau had shaped economic policy through the Depression and war financing. His infamous Morgenthau Plan for post-war Germany, which FDR had tentatively endorsed at the Quebec Conference in 1944, called for dismantling the country's industrial base and converting it into a pastoral economy to prevent future militarism. In cabinet discussions, Morgenthau pushed this vision aggressively, expecting Truman to endorse it as a continuation of Roosevelt's punitive stance toward the Axis. But Truman, informed by his own readings of history and briefings from military advisors, saw the plan as short-sighted. It risked starving millions and creating a vacuum that Stalin could exploit. Morgenthau's insistence reflected not just policy preference but an emotional tie to FDR, who had treated him like family. To Morgenthau, deviating from the plan felt like betrayal. Then there was Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Commerce and FDR's Vice President from 1941 to 1945, whose ouster from the ticket in 1944 had paved the way for Truman. Wallace, an Iowa-born agronomist with progressive ideals, harbored open resentment toward his successor, viewing Truman as a machine politician lacking vision. In meetings, Wallace advocated for conciliatory approaches to the Soviets, echoing FDR's belief in personal diplomacy to foster global unity. He downplayed Stalin's encroachments in Eastern Europe as temporary security measures, urging Truman to prioritize economic aid and UN collaboration over confrontation. Wallace's background as a former Republican-turned-New Dealer made him a bridge to liberals, but his idealism clashed with Truman's emerging realism. Privately, Wallace confided to allies that Truman was ruining FDR's dreams of a cooperative world order. Attorney General Francis Biddle rounded out this cadre of Roosevelt loyalists. A Philadelphia blue blood educated at Harvard, Biddle had enforced New Deal reforms and overseen wartime internment policies since 1941. In the cabinet, he positioned himself as the defender of domestic progressivism, often steering conversations toward preserving labor rights and antitrust measures while showing scant deference to Truman's authority. Biddle's aloof demeanor, barely acknowledging the new president in discussions, stemmed from years of direct access to FDR, who consulted him on everything from Supreme Court picks to civil liberties. Like the others, Biddle operated under the assumption that the administration's core mission was to extend Roosevelt's reforms, not adapt to a novice leader's directives. What united these men was more than shared history. It was a collective commitment to FDR's optimistic framework for the post-war era, one that emphasized alliance building and economic reconstruction over ideological rivalry. They interpreted Truman's probing questions as ignorance or meddling, not as necessary oversight. This mindset was exacerbated by FDR's own compartmentalized style, which had encouraged aides to handle portfolios independently, fostering silos of expertise that now resisted integration under new leadership. Truman, drawing on his Senate investigations into wartime waste, recognized these as barriers to effective governance. He began to see the cabinet not as allies but as potential obstacles, their loyalties divided between the living president and the memory of the departed one. This internal discord played out against the backdrop of escalating global tensions. As reports trickled in of Soviet forces consolidating control in Poland, arresting non-communist leaders and rigging elections, Truman's suspicions grew. The cabinet's evasions on Yalta details, such as FDR's verbal assurances to Stalin on Asian territories like the Kuril Islands and Port Arthur without consulting China, highlighted a dangerous naivety. These concessions, intended to secure Soviet participation against Japan, now appeared as gifts to an expansionist regime. Truman's World War I scars reminded him that alliances could sour quickly. He needed advisors attuned to these shifts, not ones wedded to outdated pacts. The friction wasn't just professional, it was personal. Truman, often underestimated due to his folksy manner and lack of charisma compared to FDR's fireside chat eloquence, felt the sting of condescension. Yet, his resilience, honed through business failures and political battles, fueled a quiet determination. As spring turned to summer, these conflicts crystallized Truman's conviction. To lead effectively, he had to confront the ghosts in his own house. The stage was set for a bold overhaul, one that would test the limits of political loyalty in a time of uncertainty. With the cabinet's guarded briefings fueling his frustrations, Truman took matters into his own hands, demanding access to the raw documents from Roosevelt's final diplomatic triumphs. What he uncovered in those classified files transformed his view of the post-war landscape and solidified his resolve to reshape the team around him. The Yalta Conference agreements, signed in February 1945 amid the snow-swept palaces of Crimea, represented FDR's bold gamble for a stable peace. Over 8 days, Roosevelt, weakened by illness but sharp in negotiation, had bargained with Stalin and Churchill to outline Europe's future. The pacts included dividing Germany into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet, with joint control of Berlin, commitments to free and unfettered elections in Poland and other liberated nations, and the framework for the United Nations, set to convene in San Francisco that April. In exchange for Stalin's pledge to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat, FDR had acquiesced to Soviet territorial claims in the Far East, including the Kuril Islands, southern Sakhalin, and influence over Chinese ports like Port Arthur and Dairen, concessions made without fully consulting Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government in China. Truman pored over the transcripts and memos, piecing together the nuances that his advisors had glossed over. The language on Poland was particularly troubling. FDR had agreed to a provisional government broadly representative of democratic elements but friendly to the Soviet Union, a phrasing Stalin twisted to justify installing a communist-led regime in Warsaw. Non-communist Polish leaders, many from the London-based government in exile that had fought alongside the Allies, were sidelined or arrested by Soviet forces. Similarly, the accords lacked firm timelines for Red Army withdrawals from Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, allowing Stalin to maintain indefinite military occupations under the guise of security. Truman saw these not as mutual understandings but as one-sided yields, born of FDR's faith in personal rapport with Uncle Joe Stalin, a nickname Roosevelt used to humanize the dictator. Exhausted from travel and health woes, FDR had prioritized short-term Allied unity over ironclad safeguards, betting that post-war cooperation through the UN would temper Soviet ambitions. The revelations hit Truman hard, especially as intelligence reports confirmed Stalin's violations. By May 1945, with Victory in Europe Day celebrated, Soviet troops were entrenching in Eastern Europe, suppressing dissent and propping up puppet governments. Truman confided to aides that FDR's concessions had effectively handed half a continent to communist control, undermining the very principles America fought for. This wasn't abstract diplomacy. It echoed Truman's own experiences with power imbalances, from his Senate probes into corrupt contractors to the trench warfare of 1918, where vague alliances could cost lives. He began questioning the cabinet's motives. Were they withholding details to protect FDR's image, or because they still believed in his vision of a trusting partnership with Moscow? This growing clarity converged with a pivotal moment, the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Truman's first face-to-face with the Allied leaders. Held in a bomb-scarred suburb of Berlin, the summit marked a shift in dynamics. Churchill, initially wary of the untested American, found common ground with Truman's forthright style, especially as reports of Soviet overreach mounted. Stalin, ever the opportunist, probed for weaknesses, but Truman held firm on issues like German reparations and Polish borders. Midway through, on July 16, Truman received word from Stimson about the successful Trinity test, the first atomic detonation in New Mexico's desert. Emboldened, he casually informed Stalin of a new weapon of unusual destructive force, unaware that Soviet spies had already infiltrated the Manhattan Project. Stalin's feigned nonchalance masked his acceleration of Russia's own nuclear program, but the exchange signaled Truman's willingness to leverage American power independently. Potsdam crystallized Truman's strategic pivot. The conference's terminal declaration called for Japan's unconditional surrender, paving the way for the atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9, decisions Truman made after exhaustive consultations with Stimson and military chiefs like General George Marshall. These strikes, while controversial, hastened Japan's capitulation on August 15, averting the bloody invasion of the home islands. Yet, Truman pondered how differently things might have unfolded with FDR's cabinet intact. Wallace, for instance, had floated ideas of sharing atomic technology with the Soviets to build trust, a notion Truman dismissed as naive given Stalin's duplicity. Armed with these insights, Truman reached a breaking point. In private sessions with trusted Missouri allies like Chief of Staff Matthew Connolly and advisor Clark Clifford, he outlined his plan, a systematic replacement of Roosevelt's holdovers. "I'm the president now," he declared, emphasizing that loyalty must flow to the current office, not a predecessor's memory. Advisors cautioned against wholesale changes, firing icons of the New Deal and war effort could alienate Democrats, invite media scorn, and fracture party unity ahead of midterms. But Truman, drawing on his artillery command ethos where insubordination invited disaster, prioritized unity of purpose. He began methodically. In June, he eased out Attorney General Biddle, installing Tom Clark, a tough Texan focused on anti-communist security. By July, Stettinius was out, replaced by James Burns, a shrewd South Carolinian with no sentimental ties to FDR and a hawkish eye on Soviet moves. Morgenthau followed suit that month, succeeded by Fred Vinson, a Kentucky moderate who advocated rebuilding Germany as a bulwark against communism rather than punishing it into oblivion. Wallace held on longer, but his public criticisms of Truman's get-tough policy toward Russia sealed his fate in September 1946. These moves weren't vindictive. They were calculated to assemble a cabinet aligned with emerging realities, the Soviet Union as a rival, not a partner. Potsdam had shown Truman the value of decisive action, and with the atomic age dawning, he couldn't afford divided counsel. As the dust settled from these changes, the political fallout began to brew, testing whether Truman's gamble would fortify or fracture his presidency. Truman's cabinet purge, executed with the precision of a military operation, sent shockwaves through Washington's political ecosystem and beyond, unleashing a torrent of backlash that tested the new president's mettle. By the fall of 1945, with key figures like Stettinius and Morgenthau sidelined, the Democratic Party still reeling from FDR's death fractured along ideological lines. Liberals, who revered Roosevelt as the champion of the common man, decried the moves as a betrayal of the New Deal's progressive spirit. Truman, they argued, was dismantling a winning team out of insecurity or incompetence, replacing seasoned statesmen with regional cronies more attuned to Midwestern pragmatism than global idealism. The press amplified these sentiments. Outlets like the New York Times ran editorials questioning Truman's judgment, portraying him as a provincial politician out of his depth in the atomic age. Columnists speculated whether his Missouri gang advisors like Vinson and Burns could match the intellectual firepower of FDR's brain trust. Eleanor Roosevelt, the influential former First Lady and a moral compass for liberals, added a poignant layer to the criticism. Initially supportive in the hours after FDR's passing, she had offered Truman guidance on navigating the White House. But as his foreign policy hardened, her public writings in newspapers like the New York Post subtly rebuked him. In her syndicated column My Day, she lamented shifts away from FDR's emphasis on international cooperation, implying that Truman's confrontational stance toward the Soviets risked undermining the nascent United Nations, a body her husband had envisioned as the cornerstone of lasting peace. Eleanor's words carried weight. As a delegate to the UN herself, appointed by Truman in a gesture of continuity, her critiques stung, framing his decisions as a departure from the humanitarian ethos that defined the Roosevelt era. Privately, she worried that Truman's haste in reshaping the cabinet ignored the delicate balance FDR had struck between domestic reform and global alliances. Henry Wallace emerged as the most vocal antagonist, transforming his dismissal into a platform for dissent. After being forced out in September 1946 for a speech that openly challenged Truman's belligerent approach to Russia delivered while still in office, no less Wallace embarked on a nationwide speaking tour. Drawing crowds of thousands at venues from university halls to union meetings, he championed FDR's vision of one world, arguing that Stalin's actions in Eastern Europe stemmed from insecurity rather than aggression. "We must meet the Russians halfway," Wallace proclaimed, echoing Roosevelt's Yalta optimism and accusing Truman of provoking a new arms race. His rhetoric resonated with war-weary Americans, many of whom still viewed the Soviets as allies who had borne the brunt of Nazi casualties. Wallace's Progressive Party bid in the 1948 election would later siphon votes from Truman, but in the immediate aftermath of the firings, his attacks painted the president as a warmonger, eroding support among the Democratic base. The political toll was measurable and swift. Truman's approval ratings, which had hovered around 80% in the euphoric days after VJ Day, plummeted to 32% by November 1946, according to Gallup polls the lowest for any sitting president at that point. The 1,946 midterm elections delivered a crushing blow. Republicans seized control of both the House and Senate for the first time since 1928, with Democrats losing 55 House seats and 12 inches the Senate. Pundits dubbed it the had enough election, a referendum on post-war inflation, labor strikes, and perceived leadership vacuum. Whispers in Washington corridors suggested Truman might not seek re-election in 1948, with party elders eyeing alternatives like General Dwight Eisenhower. Even within his own circle, doubts surfaced. Some advisors urged compromise to stem the bleeding. Internationally, the shake-up elicited mixed reactions that underscored Truman's evolving role on the world stage. Winston Churchill, who had bonded with FDR over cigars and strategy sessions, initially expressed reservations about the newcomer. In private correspondence unearthed later, Churchill described Truman post-Potsdam as earnest but unseasoned, fearing the cabinet changes might signal American instability at a time when Europe needed firm U.S. backing against Soviet encroachment. Yet, as Truman's policies took shape, rejecting Morgenthau's draconian plan for Germany in favor of reconstruction, Churchill warmed. By 1946, in his famous Iron Curtain speech at Westminster College in Missouri, Churchill implicitly endorsed Truman's realism, warning of Soviet threats in terms that aligned with the president's hardening line. Other allies, like Francis Charles de Gaulle, watched warily, concerned that internal U.S. turmoil could weaken commitments to European recovery. Amid the storm, Truman remained steadfast, drawing strength from his voracious reading of history. He devoured biographies of past presidents like Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, who had faced similar cabinet rebellions and emerged stronger. "History teaches that you can't lead by committee," he noted in his memoirs, viewing the backlash as the price of progress. Rather than retreat, he doubled down, using the criticism to refine his message to the American people. In radio addresses, he framed the changes as essential for confronting new challenges, subtly shifting blame to FDR's outdated assumptions about Stalin. This persistence stemmed from Truman's core belief in accountability. As a former haberdasher who had gone bankrupt, he knew that clinging to failed strategies invited ruin. The reactions, while bruising, forced Truman to articulate his vision more clearly, laying the groundwork for policies that would define the early Cold War. As the dust from the midterms settled, the true test loomed, whether his remade administration could deliver results that silenced the doubters. Truman's willingness to endure the political storm paid dividends in the long arc of history, as his revamped administration confronted Soviet expansion with strategies that preserved Western democracy and averted a Third World War. By 1947, with most of FDR's inner circle replaced, Truman's team, now including figures like Secretary of State George Marshall, a no-nonsense Army general revered for his role in World War II, could pursue policies unencumbered by outdated loyalties. The Truman Doctrine, announced in March 1947, marked the first major fruit of this shift. A $400 million aid package to Greece and Turkey to resist communist insurgencies, framed as America's commitment to support free peoples against subjugation. This wasn't just rhetoric. It signaled a departure from FDR's collaborative hopes, acknowledging Stalin's regime as an ideological adversary bent on domination. History bore out Truman's instincts on the Yalta concessions. Stalin, far from honoring pledges for democratic elections, orchestrated sham votes across Eastern Europe. In Poland, the 1947 elections were rigged under Red Army oversight, installing a communist government that crushed opposition figures like those from the Home Army who had resisted Nazis. Similar patterns unfolded in Hungary, where rigged 1,947 polls elevated Matthias Rákosi's dictatorship. In Romania, King Michael was forced to abdicate in 1947 amid Soviet pressure, and in Czechoslovakia, the 1,948 coup d'état, known as the Victorious February, toppled the last non-communist government in the region. Bulgaria and East Germany followed suit, with Soviet troops ensuring compliance until the Iron Curtain solidified. These regimes endured until the late 1980s, validating Truman's view that FDR's ambiguities had enabled a Soviet sphere, not a liberated Europe. Had Truman heeded Wallace's calls for more trust, as advocated in his public tirades, the West might have acquiesced, allowing communism to creep further. Rejecting the Morgenthau Plan proved equally prescient. Morgenthau's blueprint, which aimed to strip Germany of its factories and mines to prevent rearmament, would have left 80 million people in economic ruin, fostering resentment and vulnerability to Soviet influence. Truman, influenced by Burns and Vinson, pivoted to a reconstruction model that divided Germany but bolstered the Western zones. This laid the groundwork for the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949, sparking the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950 seconds. Fueled by American investment, West Germany's GDP surged 8% annually, transforming it into Europe's industrial powerhouse and a key NATO ally. Without this shift, a destitute Germany could have become a breeding ground for extremism, much like the Weimar Republic's collapse in the 1930 seconds. The Marshall Plan, unveiled in June 1947 by Truman's new Secretary of State, amplified these successes on a continental scale. Officially the European Recovery Program, it injected $13 billion, over $150 billion today, into 16 nations, rebuilding infrastructure devastated by war. In France and Italy, where communist parties polled strongly amid post-war poverty, the aid stabilized economies, marginalizing leftist insurgencies and fostering democratic capitalism. Truman's team designed it with strings attached. Recipients had to cooperate economically and resist Soviet pressure, contrasting sharply with FDR's more unconditional Yalta dealings. Stalin rejected the plan for his satellites, viewing it as capitalist encroachment, which further isolated the Eastern Bloc and highlighted the divide. The plan's triumph prevented a domino effect of communist takeovers, preserving Western Europe's freedom and laying the economic foundation for the European Union decades later. Truman's atomic decisions, informed late but acted upon decisively, also underscored the value of his independent counsel. The bombings ended the Pacific War swiftly, saving an estimated 250,000 to 500,000 Allied lives that an invasion would have claimed. Yet, in the Cold War context, they demonstrated American resolve, deterring Stalin from bolder moves in Europe. If FDR's cabinet had lingered, particularly Wallace, who later advocated nuclear sharing with Moscow, the U.S. might have diluted its technological edge, emboldening Soviet adventurism. The Berlin airlift of 1948 to 1949 epitomized Truman's containment strategy in action. When Stalin blockaded West Berlin to force Allied withdrawal, Truman, backed by Marshall and military advisors, opted for a massive air supply operation, delivering 2.3 million tons of goods over 11 months without firing a shot. This non-violent stand humiliated Stalin, who lifted the blockade and galvanized the formation of NATO in 1949. The alliance, with 12 founding members, including the U.S., committed to collective defense, ensuring no Soviet incursion went unanswered. Truman's policies thus contained communism without escalation, averting the global conflict that FDR's cooperative illusions might have invited. Even the United Nations, FDR's cherished creation, benefited from Truman's adjustments. While honoring its 1945 founding in San Francisco, where Truman addressed the assembly, his administration wielded veto power in the Security Council to block Soviet overreach, transforming the body from a naive forum into a pragmatic tool for Western interests. Without Truman's realism, the UN might have faltered as a rubber stamp for great power deals, much like the League of Nations before it. In retrospect, Truman's cabinet overhaul wasn't spiteful but essential, aligning U.S. leadership with the Cold War's harsh truths. FDR, a master of inspiration, had navigated the Depression and war through charisma and compromise, but his health and optimism blinded him to Stalin's ruthlessness, evident in intelligence ignored about Soviet spies and purges. Truman, the everyman president, brought grounded judgment, prioritizing facts over legacy. His approval rebounded, culminating in his upset 1948 election victory over Thomas Dewey, vindicating his choices. By the time he left office in 1953, the framework he built, containment, alliances, economic aid, defined American foreign policy for generations, proving that true leadership sometimes demands clearing the deck to chart a new course. In facing down the old guard, Truman didn't just inherit a presidency, he redefined it for an era of enduring rivalry.